Story 1. The Stalker in the Woods. Location: remote cabin in Oregon. Guest: Sarah, solo traveler. Sarah had always prided herself on being independent and adventurous, and when she found a secluded Airbnb cabin in Oregon, it seemed like the perfect place to unwind and clear her head after a stressful breakup. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any city or town, and the promise of solitude was exactly what she needed. The pictures on the listing showed a cozy, well-maintained cabin with a wood stove, a large deck overlooking the forest, and no neighbors for miles. When Sarah arrived, the place was just as beautiful as it had looked online. The air was crisp and clean, and the towering trees surrounding the cabin made her feel like she was in another world. After unpacking and settling in, she poured herself a glass of wine and curled up with a book in front of the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the sun began to set, an odd feeling crept over her. It was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She brushed it off, chalking it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. As night fell, the sounds of the forest began to come alive: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But soon Sarah started hearing something else. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. Sarah froze, her heart racing. The listing had been clear: no neighbors for miles. She grabbed her phone, but it showed no signal, no way to call for help. She forced herself to peek out the window. Nothing. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. Telling herself it must have been an animal, she tried to calm down. But just as she was about to sit back down, the footsteps resumed, this time coming closer. She could hear them circling the cabin. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. She locked the deadbolt and backed away, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a soft, almost polite knock. She held her breath, waiting. Another knock. Sarah stared at the door, terrified. The person outside didn't speak, didn't call out, just knocked softly again and again. After what felt like hours, the knocking finally stopped. But Sarah didn't dare open the door. She sat on the floor, clutching her phone, eyes glued to the entrance. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. In the morning, she packed her bags and left, vowing never to return to that cabin. Later, she learned from a local that the area had a disturbing history. A hermit had once lived in the woods nearby and was known for sneaking up on campers and knocking on their doors. He had disappeared years ago, but rumors persisted that his spirit still wandered the forest, looking for people to scare. Story 2. The Haunted Dollhouse. Location: Victorian mansion in Savannah, Georgia. Guest: Mark and Jessica, married couple. Mark and Jessica were history buffs who loved staying in old historical homes whenever they traveled. For their anniversary, they booked a stay in a Victorian mansion in Savannah, Georgia, one of the most haunted cities in the United States. The Airbnb listing boasted of the home's rich history, and it didn't shy away from its reputation for being haunted. The idea of a haunted house excited both of them. After all, they didn't believe in ghosts. When they arrived, the house was as grand and eerie as they had hoped. Ornate woodwork, high ceilings, and a long staircase leading to their room on the second floor. The house was filled with antiques, adding to its otherworldly charm. On their first night, everything seemed normal, until Jessica noticed something strange in the corner of their room: an old dollhouse, placed carefully on a small table near the window. It was intricately detailed, a miniature replica of the mansion they were staying in. Curiously, Jessica opened the dollhouse and peered inside. Every room of the real house was replicated in the dollhouse, down to the tiniest detail. Even the furniture was the same. "Creepy, but kinda cool," Mark said, shrugging it off. They closed the dollhouse and went to bed, laughing about how the Airbnb host was leaning into the haunted mansion theme. In the middle of the night, Jessica woke up with a start. She wasn't sure why, but something felt off. The room was dark except for the dim light filtering through the curtains. Then she heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. She glanced toward the dollhouse and her breath caught in her throat. The tiny lights inside the dollhouse were on, casting a soft glow through its miniature windows. Jessica shook Mark awake, and they both stared in horror as they saw tiny figures moving inside the dollhouse, figures that looked eerily like them. One tiny figure was lying in the miniature bed just as they were, while the other stood by the window, looking out. Mark rushed to the dollhouse, his hands trembling as he opened it. But the moment he did, the lights inside flickered and went out. The figures were gone. The rooms were empty. They spent the rest of the night wide awake, too terrified to sleep. The next morning they packed up and left, cutting their stay short. Before they left, they asked the Airbnb host about the dollhouse. She hesitated, then admitted that previous guests had reported the same strange occurrences. Some believed the house was haunted by the original owners, who had built the dollhouse as a way to watch over the mansion long after their deaths. Story 3. The room that shouldn't exist. Location. Modern apartment in New York City. Guest, Jason, business traveler. Jason, a frequent business traveler, was used to staying in Airbnbs across the country. He preferred them over hotels for their homey feel. During a trip to New York City, he booked a stay in a sleek modern apartment in Manhattan. The place was perfect, clean, well lit, and centrally located. He had no complaints. On his second night, after a long day of meetings, Jason returned to the apartment and decided to explore the building a bit. It was an old building, recently renovated, and he liked the idea of seeing how they had transformed the space. While wandering down a hallway on the 4th floor, he noticed a door that didn't seem to fit with the rest of the building's design. It was older, more worn, and the number on the door, 4B, was scratched and faded. Curious, Jason tried the handle, and to his surprise, the door opened. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, completely out of place with the rest of the modern apartment building. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and there was a musty smell, like the room hadn't been used in years. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing the door. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the room felt wrong. He quickly closed the door and hurried back to his apartment. That night he had trouble sleeping, the image of the strange room replaying in his mind. Around 2 a.m., he was startled awake by a loud banging sound. It was coming from the hallway, right where the mysterious room was located. Jason crept to his door and listened. The banging continued, followed by a voice, low and indistinct, muttering something he couldn't make out. Against his better judgment, Jason opened the door and peeked down the hall. The door to 4B was wide open, and the chair inside the room had been moved. Now it was facing the hallway. The banging continued, louder and more frantic. Jason slammed his door shut and locked it, his heart racing. He left the next morning, too shaken to stay another night. Later, he found out from a neighbor that 4B wasn't supposed to exist. The building's blueprints showed no such room. These stories serve as chilling reminders that not all Airbnbs offer the restful nights they promise. Sometimes the scariest part of staying in a new place isn't the solitude. It's what you might encounter when you're alone.